You're listening to The Authenticity Show, where you get to eavesdrop on great conversations about health, creativity, and the quest for excellence. We recently had pianist Lanzo Luconi as a guest in episode 27. Well, he's back to nerd out with me about music. Carlos and Satch are not here today, so it's just me and Lanzo. Now, even if you're not a musician, you'll still appreciate this conversation. We start out by discussing dissonance in music and its historical development through the music eras, but then we get into some deep philosophical stuff about what music is. It's fascinating. So here we go. Welcome to the Authenticity Show, Music Nerd Edition. I'm Oliver Althoen.
And Lanzo Luconi.
All right. Hey, Lanzo, how you doing?
Good. What's going on, man?
Interesting being here without Carlos and Satch, huh?
I know.
It's like we're sneaking around behind their backs.
I know. I hope they didn't get mad at us.
They'll never find out.
No, probably not. Nobody needs to know.
So anyway, we are both music nerds, and we are here tonight to talk about dissonance.
Among many things, yes.
So what exactly is dissonance? We were talking about this a minute ago. It's not the easiest thing to come up with a definition for, actually.
Yeah, we were actually, sort of debating whether we should embark this definition as a subjective concept or as a mathematical objective.
Well, I think clearly it's both. I mean, in a nutshell, I think of dissonance as anytime you have a clashing sound in music, right?
Right.
I mean, that's basically it. And people, that might be an imprecise definition, but I think people know what that means.
Yes, but I guess, there's so much to it, right? I think, and like we were talking earlier, a lot of it is contextual. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and our ears also get used to dissonances that eventually become more welcome in our ears, and therefore we now define them as consonant sounds,
So sounds that several hundred years ago would have been considered extremely dissonant,
right,
today we accept as just, normal sounds.
Right. And earlier you mentioned the dominant seventh chord, for example.
Right.
Which probably, in the 1500s would have been extremely disturbing even.
Right,
to
not
ear.
the kind of thing you could end a piece on. You would have to resolve that.
Right, and not to mention a major seventh chord, right?
Sure.
Which wasn't really introduced as such until when, like, maybe the very end of the 19th century, early 20th century.
Yeah.
Sometimes, I mean, you can hear that interval many times, but it was never a vertical, sound, and it was not fully intentional. It was just the consequence of the horizontal lines, meeting to that point, and perhaps just as an appoggiatura, as a non-harmonic tone that would later resolve.
Right, but not a structural component.
Not a structural vertical chord.
So for listeners who don't know, an interval in music is anytime you have more than one note sounding at the same time.
Right, and it's the distance between those.
Right, that's the interval. So, I mean, the classic dissonant interval, going back to medieval times, is called the tritone, right? You can call it an augmented fourth, a diminished fifth, but basically it's 6 half steps or 6 semitones, and this was called the devil's interval, right?
Mm-hmm. Diabolus in musica.
Diabolus in musica, the devil, which is also the name of a Slayer album, by the way.
Oh, I don't know that. That's pretty cool.
Anyway, but that's much later. But yeah, so this interval was considered dissonant, and it was basically forbidden. You couldn't write this interval into your Gregorian chant or whatever medieval piece you were writing. You just didn't do it. It just didn't happen.
Right. And in fact, it was, punishable by the church.
Yeah. I mean, would they burn you at the stake or something?
I don't know if they would burn you. They would probably throw you in jail if you published music with, deliberate tritones in it.
Man. It was so easy to break the rules back then. But then, of course, this dissonant interval, if we fast forward a couple hundred years, becomes the most important structural element in Western-style musical harmony.
Right, and as harmony evolved, if we look at the traditional scales, right, and maybe in this instance, the major scale, it is just one of the 7, steps. Is that it would happens naturally in the 7th note of the scale. Right? If you build a triad on the 7th note of the scale,
Right.
it just happens naturally, right?
So you're talking about B, D, F, these three
Right.
notes.
If we were
on
in
the
C
piano.
major, it would be the F. Then we would
Right.
have the B and the F, as that diminished fifth.
Right.
And
That's
it just
right
happens
there.
naturally in this scale, and these are, I guess, natural dissonances
Right.
within
exactly.
tonal music.
B to F. My first music theory instructor called that the barf interval.
The barf interval.
B to F, right? And so that was the way to remember that one was the dissonant one.
Right.
I still remember that.
Yeah. But even then, like if we go back to Gregorian chants and Gregorian modes, these dissonances happen in different notes of the scale of the modes.
Right.
But it's just some of them were avoided. And when we fast forward now,
Yeah.
we don't really avoid any of this of the steps of the scale.
Right. So in music, when music got into, let's say the 17th century, with Baroque music especially, you need to have dissonance, otherwise there's no resolution, there's no tension and release, there's no
Exactly.
story, there's nothing happening.
Exactly. And I'm glad you bring that up because it's part of creating a story, right? It's like writing a story. You need that conflict.
Exactly. There's got to be
And-
conflict, otherwise it's uninteresting.
Right, exactly. You can't just, stay in the tonic chord or in the one chord, right, the whole time.
Right.
There's gotta be movement, and there's gotta be that dissonance that if you do it, artfully builds up until you resolve it. And you can build it up and resolve it in many different ways.
Right.
And ultimately just at the end do like the ultimate resolution to it, coming back to the
Yeah.
original, the tonic, right, or the original tone that the piece started with.
Right. So when the dominant chord resolves to the tonic chord, the one chord, the tritone, that's the functional dissonant element in the dominant 7th chord, resolves in a particular way that all, music students learn at some point in their music training, the resolution of the tritone, and it's like a textbook cadence that makes you feel like you've arrived at home at
Right.
the end of a piece.
Because it carries a lot of that dissonance, and if you resolve it, when you resolve it, it resolves that conflict, right? That clash that we're talking about is, finally ceases, and we can breathe. It's like
Right.
that.
Exactly. And we're also so well trained with that. I mean, whether you're a music specialist or not, you have been culturally trained to hear this, in
Yes.
music.
Right.
The end of every Beethoven piece you've ever heard in your life, it goes, from the dominant to the tonic chord.
Oh
right?
yeah. And then, gosh, in most of the music of the Baroque and classical, and even most of the Romantic period, that dominant to tonic chord at 5-1 resolution or cadence is probably the most common. And even if you're not musically trained, unconsciously you are used to listening to this resolution.
Absolutely.
And it even doesn't really matter what type of music
Right.
you listen to or you prefer. This is happening all the time. Even in non-traditional or I guess more modern music, at some point, maybe it's not at the end, maybe there's different ways to do it, but this concept of resolution of dissonance is happening constantly. It can be done in many different ways, but it's always about resolving the dissonance.
Resolving the dissonance. Right. And so historically, over time, we talked about the medieval period with Gregorian chant going through, the various stages of musical evolution that's happened. And we're talking about European music here in this context.
Yes.
Eventually, there was kind of almost like a singularity. I mean, something happened and there was no turning back. And sometimes this is referred to as the emancipation of the dissonance, right? Right around the year 1900, the turn of the century, right? The turn of last century.
Right.
It was like this musical revolution where all of a sudden anything goes, like all the rules are out the window. And this is in large part brought about by Arnold Schoenberg.
Among many others. I think he's one of the main composers that embraced dissonance in a non-traditional way.
Yeah.
and was brave enough, in a way, to create a movement himself. Like, it was like, because Schoenberg, and I think, like, who else comes to mind? I think Debussy is one of those two that just completely
definitely
destroys the current or the traditional model of harmony.
Right, but they did it in such different ways, you know what I mean?
They did it in such different ways, and that's what you talked about, that it just went out the window. It was like a free-for-all. However, all of them knew the rules of traditional harmony perfectly.
Right.
So they could break it, right? Because when you have these rules and you're trying to also create music, you're a composer, certain rules will limit your ideas and your and the own concepts that you develop through your experience. And at some point you say, wait a second, traditionally this should be done this way, but in my mind, what I'm trying to say doesn't work if I do it that way. Does that make sense? So maybe a more specific example would be, okay, traditionally the minor seventh resolves down, right? Mm-hmm. Traditionally.
Yeah.
But
traditional voice leading, the seventh.
The voice leading, right? Exactly. Yeah. But if you take Debussy's language, where he's more interested in color and in that sound effect, rather than voice leading, and you listen to a piece like the Sunken Cathedral, where you have a series of dominant seventh chords, parallel dominant seventh chords. What happened there? It's
that's a magical piece.
It's a magical piece, but at the time was a very controversial piece as well. And many of his works, especially his later works, kind of create this new way of writing music. When you achieve certain confidence in your expression, in your way of expression, you no longer care about all the rules that you learn. You care about the product that you want to create.
Right. The rules serve you instead of the other way around.
Exactly. Yeah. Just and this happens. Interesting that you say that, because this happens in performance as well, not just composition, but in performance. Like all the rules, like technique, for example. Technique should be at the service of the music and not the other way around. Right, you learn technique to have more tools for performance and not the other way around.
Right, but that's an advanced level.
That's at advanced level, but that's what we're talking about here with these composers. Someone like Schoenberg, who had crazy ideas about music and just especially structuring music in general. Mm-hmm. You can see, for example, Debussy can be in ways like structurally traditional. Schoenberg's earlier works are actually quite traditional.
Right, yeah. It was called Expressionism, I believe.
Expressionism, right. Yeah. But then when he gets into this experimental phase, there's a different type of structure. As his own structure becomes almost... Right. Is almost like he created his own mathematics to build a system of composition. I think
with Schoenberg, he was basically pushing the limits, right? In his early music, he was working within the tonal system, but just trying to get as much emotional content, this is why it's called expressionism, as he could. And at a certain point, that system just no longer served. It wasn't enough for him to express his really intense feelings in his music, So basically, it just shattered the whole system, and he was forced to invent his own system for his own expressive needs.
Der Dichter, den die Andacht treibt, berauscht sich an den heiligen Tranke. Gen Himmel wendet verzückt das Haupt.
Exactly. And he's not a special case in this, in this realm of experimentation and breaking the rules, but he's one of the first. So I think that's why he's attributed to, this radical change in thought.
Right.
But if we go forward, not even just a couple of decades, we run into very similar cases, and one of the composers I'm thinking about now that had a similar evolution with a completely different language was Alexander Scriabin. And but he started again very romantic even. He was a huge fan of Chopin.
Oh,
in fact, his earlier work sound a lot like Chopin. But then you get into his, piano sonatas, and especially the later ones, and my God, things get weird. Things get weird.
Okay, so let's listen to a couple of examples and compare them here. So what early Scriabin piece should we listen to?
So we should listen to the Opus 2 etudes. There's 3 pieces, Opus 2.
Okay.
Specifically the third one. And I think of this one because it sounds so much like Chopin.
Okay.
Very traditional, very tonal.
All right, let's give it a listen. Here we go. Okay, wow, yeah, that sounded so like normal, so almost naive sounding,
Right.
And
clearly influenced by the music of Chopin. And not even as intricate as Chopin. If you listen to Chopin's mazurkas, some of them are very elaborate. This one is, more simple, I guess.
Yeah.
It's almost like emulating his idol, right?
Right, yeah. Okay, so what's next? What are we going to compare it to?
So I think we should do like 3 different points of his life.
Okay, cool.
So this is one of the early works. We should listen to one of his early sonatas, maybe the 4th sonata.
Okay.
Which is not so early, but it's part of the transition into the weirdness.
Okay, so what is this again?
The 4th sonata.
Okay, so Scriabin sonata.
Scriabin sonata number 4.
Okay, here we go. Wow, interesting. So what are we listening to there?
So I don't know if you notice the openness now of the harmonies, and that how he embraces dissonance and extended chords as just his basic chords, right? Or his basic harmony is already made of extended chords.
So dissonances that don't necessarily need to resolve.
Right. These are just part of the harmonic structures as they are.
Yeah. It almost sounds like jazz chords I'm hearing.
Some of them, can certainly be turned into jazz now if we change the context of it, for sure.
So when was this written? Was it during the same time as jazz was being written?
Well, this is, I guess, in the early 1900s.
Okay, so the beginnings of jazz.
Beginnings of jazz, ragtimes, all these new genres almost
right.
being born.
Yeah, it almost reminded me a little bit of Debussy there, because there's dissonances.
There is a lot of color. Absolutely. Now it's all about color, right? It's not much about this vertical harmony.
Right.
But it's about the horizontal lines and what colors these sounds create. And actually, Scriabin was one of the better known composers with what is it called? With actual...
Oh, I think you're synesthesia.
Synesthesia, thank you.
Yeah. where he would see colors associated with musical sounds.
Yes, and it's very interesting to actually see how he himself represented each key with a color.
Oh wow!
So there's charts and everything that you can look up with how with all the colors that he represents sounds with.
Interesting.
I mean, and there's a lot of exploration of him going on to retreats and sort of getting lost in nature and just becoming very philosophical and
right, almost mystical.
Right? And he actually, he invented the mystical chord. Right?
The mystical chord. I've heard of that. Can you remind me what that is?
Well, the first interval is a tritone.
Okay.
Right.
Our old friend, the devil.
The devil, exactly. And then we have the diminished fourth, and then another diminished fourth.
Okay. I mean, so anyway, if you're really interested, you can look this up.
You can look, yeah.
We're on Wikipedia right now, just looking at the mystic chord.
So this is a chord that you can, or this color, this harmony, you can see it all throughout his later works.
Okay. So it became his thing.
This was his thing.
His thing.
And this was just the beginning.
All right.
Now we're going to listen to perhaps his 8th or 9th sonata, or his 10th sonata, maybe, his last one.
Okay, 10th sonata?
Or let's listen to the Black Mass sonata.
The Black Mass sonata.
Black Mass sonata.
Okay,
yes.
Alexander Scriabin excerpt here from the Black Mass sonata. All right, man. We just went to outer space with that stuff.
Yeah.
So what's going on there? I mean, are we hearing the mystic chord again? Because it sounds like just completely free and like, I mean, are we improvising here? What's going on?
I think there's, a lot of now, not just the mystic chord, but that mystic feel to it altogether. Like that feeling of, I guess, floating in nothingness, where we don't have real defined structures. Right?
And yet we were looking at the score for this as we were listening to it, and the score looked very precise.
It is very precise, and in fact, he meant every single note that he wrote. It's there for a reason, and is not just the product of chance, but he clearly wrote this with purpose. And also you can see all the awkward rhythmic values that make it sound like it's being improvised, and it makes it sound like it's just off, but it's not.
Yeah. Sometimes he'll do this thing I noticed where the high notes are sort of beautiful and shimmery, and then he'll hit like a low note that just recontextualizes what you just heard and gives you that kind of dissonant kind of like foundation that makes you kind of question everything you just thought was sort of nice and beautiful sounding.
Right. And
I love that kind of stuff.
And if you get deeper into the analysis, you can actually start noticing all these like different voices that he's bringing up again or repeating, but with different layers or in different sections, which make it sometimes almost imperceptible until you hear it like 10 times. Right. You're like, wait a second, this is the same theme that he used here, but now he has these other 3 melodies going on here, or there's these other 4 layers going on here, but that theme was the first one, right? Or that theme already appeared, but now is either reharmonized or appears with maybe other themes as well simultaneously.
Wow.
So it gets complex.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, it sounds like it.
So yeah, at first it might not be very friendly to the common ear, but when you learn more about this music, you learn more about Scriabin, it actually becomes fascinating.
That's the way it is with a lot of things. The more you understand, the more it draws you in.
Right, because now you're listening for something, right?
Yeah, instead of just on the outside sort of peering in the window, you're actually inside experiencing it.
Exactly.
Yeah, wow. Scriabin. Cool.
Scriabin, yeah, he's quite a deep well.
Yeah. And so, obviously after this, the lid gets blown wide open with all these crazy composers, Harry Partch, John Cage, Charles Ives, and then
even like Oliver Messiaen,
Messiaen, it's like once people realized, oh shoot, we can do whatever we want. Like once Schoenberg sort of let the cat out of the bag, it's
exactly,
like, just run with it.
Exactly, and it's interesting also to see how a lot of the composers tend to go back to original forms, sort of like how the neoclassical movement started, like go back to the original classical forms, except now with all the nuances of the modern world. Right. And, sort of like Shostakovich or Prokofiev and how they write their music. It's so traditional in a lot of senses, but then so new in other ways. So right. That's a very interesting, evolution of this particular style. Right. And then there's other composers, and I mentioned like Oliver Messiaen, that in many ways completely disregards harmony, and the concept of harmony. He doesn't see it as a vertical structure at all, but he sees it just as a product of the color of the sounds, right? So he completely disregards any sort of label for simultaneous sounds.
Wow, interesting.
It's very interesting.
Well, and Messiaen was the composer that got really into using birdsong, right?
Right. So there's also we get into the resemblance of the modern world, and I believe we had a little bit of this talk in the previous episode of the show
when you were the guest on the show with Carlos.
Right. And we talked about specifically. I remember we talked about Gershwin.
Oh, right. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
We talked about Gershwin.
Yeah. Inner city sounds.
Exactly. And in this case, you can hear Messiaen's, wanting to emulate some sounds of nature, specifically, birds.
Right. And I mean, it turns out birdsong can be rather dissonant. I mean,
it can be rather dissonant, but it can also be quite melodic.
Yeah.
It can be quite melodic, and this is actually a language. Right?
Sure, yeah.
It is it's been scientifically proven that it's an actual language. There's a communication tool between these animals, and some of the intervals actually mean or communicate a message. Wow. It's fascinating, and I think, Messiaen was up to something here. And another interesting thing about him is the, lack of rhythmic structure. A lot of the music that he wrote has no time signature.
Right. Well, maybe we should listen to an example I'm thinking of the Quartet for the End of Time.
Ooh, beautiful. The series of sounds that he chooses are or seem random.
Yeah, I didn't hear a lot of resolution in that, you know. It may be not the most dissonant thing, you know, people have heard, but there's no resolution. There's not even a tip of the hat to traditional structures of like dominant, tonic. It's just
Exactly.
It's completely free of that.
It's exactly, and you can say it's basically an atonal piece.
Right.
Because if you hear resolutions, it's because you choose to hear resolutions more than their actual, resolutions. It's not like sometimes in Mozart we can hear like that appoggiatura towards an end of a phrase that then resolves.
Right.
We really don't hear that here. We hear it almost like as we please, like whatever interval you want to hold on to, it becomes just relative to the previous sound.
Right. So it's a Rorschach test.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So
yeah, wow.
And then adding that layer of rhythmic complexity of it, where there's no time signature, there's only note values. So there's no downbeat, there's no upbeats, there's no high part of the phrase. There's no resolution, like a rhythmic resolution either. Mm-hmm. So it's a completely different language here.
Yeah. Wow. And so this music we've been listening to, the Scriabin, the Messiaen, at this point, it's 2018 right now. This was all written a long time ago.
Yeah.
I mean, this is considered modern music, right? But the modern era has come and gone. Musically speaking, we're not in the modern era anymore.
Oh no, and even
mean?
the time difference between Messiaen and Scriabin is quite a bit.
Right. So this piece was written in the early 1940s, right? The Messiaen.
Yeah. Actually, during the World War II.
During World War II,
because
right.
Messiaen was a prisoner of war.
Right.
I think he wrote this in a prisoner camp.
Yeah. Could because the Nazis, took over Paris.
Yeah. And the clarification. We should make the clarification that he was not in a concentration camp.
Right.
He was a prisoner of war.
Prisoner of war, right? It wasn't an extermination camp.
It was not an extermination camp. It was not.
But still,
he was just basically under the.
He was in jail.
Imprisoned.
Yeah. Yeah, man. So I guess from his point of view, maybe the world was coming to an end. I mean, his country had been taken over by the enemy. I mean, his whole world was, up in chaos. Right. So this music that has no foundation, no structure, almost is like a perfect, representation of his world at the time.
His world, yeah.
It's like an authentic expression of what he was going through as a human being at the time.
Absolutely.
So let me ask you, Lanzo, what is the future of dissonance? I mean, at this point, dissonance is everywhere, but we still have music that sounds. I mean, we still hear perfect, authentic cadences. If you listen to a Taylor Swift song, a lot of times there's a 5/1 cadence, and so it's not like we've completely abandoned this idea as a culture.
Right, and I think, in fact, when we're talking about mainstream music, right, and commercial mainstream music, it has actually simplified quite a bit. Yeah, so the music of the masses, right, now is actually really simple compared to, all the trajectory of music throughout history.
Perhaps, yeah, perhaps. Although there's so much music everywhere these days. It's
Right, but I'm talking about that mainstream music, right?
Yeah.
Because especially in the 19th century, it branched out. The styles branched out so much that I guess one of these branches was just the simplified music. It's just, I guess, easier. It's easier to follow. It's easier to play. It's easier to sing to. Right.
Easier to dance to.
Easier to dance to. Like, can you imagine a Beatles song with the same concept as Messiaen? It just doesn't work, right?
Next time we have a dance party, let's put on Quartet for the End of Time.
Right, see what happens.
And watch the dance floor just like clear out immediately.
Exactly, right.
Yeah. One place where dissonance can really take center stage actually is in film music. Like if you're watching a movie and there's a suspenseful scene going on, or maybe a horror movie, I mean, there is some serious dissonance. My hair is like standing up on my arms right now just thinking about it. And so that's perfect because it's part of the story. It's part of the tension, like we're talking about.
Right, but now you have a an additional stimulus, right?
Right.
In this case, it's the visual stimulus that you're getting. You're associating it now with the music and with the situation. It's contextual as well.
Right. And actually some great, classical composers have been film composers. I'm thinking about Stravinsky, right?
Stravinsky, yeah, absolutely.
Was a film composer. I mean, he lived in Hollywood for a while, right?
Uh-huh,
yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, it's not like film music is totally separate from classical music. So we've been talking a lot about the evolution of music over the last, 400 or 500 years, and particularly the role of dissonance as dissonance becomes more prominent and more accepted. But it seems like after like the 1920s, 1930s, maybe up to the 40s, it seems like that direction of dissonance getting more and more prominent maybe hit a wall and started to slow down a little bit, because after that it sort of seems like, the decades kind of go up and down with how much dissonance you hear in music. And obviously it can't go on forever because there's only so much dissonance that's, possible, really.
You think so? I mean, maybe there's a limit. I still don't think that we're even close to reaching a limit of dissonance.
Interesting.
And especially because of technology.
Oh, okay.
Right? And when we think about all these new sounds that are being created, things that we've never heard before. And you can see this, throughout history. I think also in the previous episode, we discussed, how the world around these composers in the early 1800s or the late 1700s was so different with the invention of the locomotive, right, or the train, and
you
the train track.
That Beethoven never heard the
Beethoven,
sound of it.
right, because the train was invented in the very early 1800s. Beethoven started going deaf, I believe, in 1797, 98, around there, right? The environment experienced a change in sound because of this new invention, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, today I can listen. One of my favorite musicians is a jazz guitarist named Nels Cline, and he gets so dissonant. Some people would just describe it as noise. I mean, many people would listen to some of Nels Cline's music and say, that's not music, that's just noise.
Right, but you can say that, also for Schoenberg's music, and for even more modern, like someone like Pierre Boulez, right?
Sure.
That's just, it just sounds like noise, like you said, right? But maybe if you dig in a little bit more and you start noticing the patterns and their thought process when they were building this, then maybe you can find something. Now, here's where the line also gets blurry. Like, now, what is music? Right. What is music?
That's a great question.
Right.
You want to take a stab at that? What is music?
What is music? Well, for me, there's got to be a clear distinction between music and noise.
And maybe the distinction is intent.
maybe it's intent.
If I make noise
Right.
and I intend it to be music, does that make it music?
Does it, right? That's a really good question. It can get like very philosophical here.
Yeah.
But as humans, we are, pattern recognition machines.
Sure, yeah.
And I guess for it to be recognizable and somewhat objective, we need some sort of organization of this sound,
Okay.
right? Of this noise.
So organized sound.
Organized sound, exactly. Organized noise.
Right.
So I think organized noise plus intent, right? Or plus meaning.
It sounds like you could be describing language.
It is very much like language.
So-
Now, can I invent my own language,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And I can invent a language that only I speak. But is it useful? Is it practical? Unless I teach it to everyone, and
Right.
it becomes of use, I think. And
Okay,
it
so
becomes
are
a tool for expression.
So wait, are you saying that the goal of music is communication?
I guess expression, right?
Expression. Okay, right.
Expression. And ultimately, if you want to express yourself, like you mentioned earlier, there's got to be some sort of desire to communicate, right?
Right.
Otherwise, the intent comes in like, is it for me or is it to communicate with others?
Well, yeah, I mean, and there's different ways of, sometimes communication can be very aggressive. Like if I punch you in the nose, that's a type of communication, right?
Right.
I mean, kind of.
And then what kind of message are you trying to?
Right, exactly. So if I have an electric guitar and I crank it up to 10 and I lean the guitar against the amplifier and it just starts feeding back, and then I go sit down and let it do that for 15 minutes on stage, I mean, is that
Right.
music? I would say yes, it is, because there's an intent. I mean,
But what are
maybe
you?
maybe
Then
the intent is just a big middle finger to the audience, or
maybe, and this is
whoever,
what
but still,
this is what happens also with modern art, right? It's like,
Sure, yeah.
anything can be art, right? Anything, literally anything. So I tend to be a little bit more conservative, when it comes to art, and in this case music. Like for me, there's gotta be a more practical intent and a more practical use of it. If you want it to be music, it should be structured in a recognizable way. And of course, it starts with the rhythm, right? Starts with organizing this sound.
okay, right?
At
Organizing it
least
time.
in terms of note values, assigned note values, assigned duration for these notes. But yeah, I mean the line can get blurry without a doubt.
Right.
If we were listening to Messiaen earlier, I mean, it's almost like the rhythm is very clear, but a traditional time signature is not. It just doesn't exist, right?
Right.
So this is already pushing the boundaries, right?
Right. Yeah. Definitely. And these are really interesting questions, and I'm sure we're not going to resolve them all.
I don't think there is a definite,
Right.
answer to this.
Yeah. Well, I think it's got to have something to do with the intent of the composer. Like, if I intend something to be music, then it's music. But I'm going to go with that.
What about without intent and people still perceive it as music? Because this happens a lot with art, right?
Oh, that is true. Yeah.
Where people just grab a bucket of paint and just throw it on the canvas, and
Right.
whatever happens is art, right? And
Right.
so, I mean, I guess, what does it mean? What does it mean to have all these like random lines and dots?
Well, maybe the fact that you're asking what it means is the intent. Just the question sometimes.
Right,
can be all you need.
but maybe that's not his. How do we know if that was his intent or not?
Or does it matter? Like, if I'm getting something out of a piece of art, does it matter what?
Right. So now we lost. Now we lost any kind of parameter to
we
define.
lost the importance of the artist's intent.
Right, but
which is
and
what I
any
started with.
parameter to define it, right? It's
Right.
like anything. Like spoken word is music. Noise is music. Closing a door is music.
Right. Or what about your heartbeat? Which
Your
is
heartbeat
not
can be
intentional.
right, or just basically anything. Anything. I believe that it is important in any case to define it, I guess, in a demonstrable way.
But we still haven't come up with a definition.
Well, for me, I guess the closest, I could never even dare to claim this definition to be absolute, but there's got to be organized sound with intent.
Organized sound with intent.
Right.
I can get behind that.
Right. And it's still not, I guess, maybe not specific enough, or maybe not narrowed down enough, but.
Right. Well, maybe that's the best we're going to do this evening.
I guess. And that's going to be a question for us to ponder for, I guess, ever.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation, Lanzo.
Yeah.
This is what we should do this more often.
Absolutely.
Music Nerd Podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, if you're still listening, thanks for tuning in to the Authenticity Show Music Nerd Edition.
All right. See you guys next time.
You've been listening to The Authenticity Show. Your hosts tonight were Oliver Althoen and Lanzo Luconi. The show is produced by Oliver Althoen. That's me. Our theme music is composed by Oliver Althoen. Again, that's me. Make sure to subscribe to the show on iTunes, Android Market, Stitcher Radio, wherever, and check out our website. It's authenticityshow.com. Thank you for listening, and have an authentic day.